Hollywood lied to you about historical battles. Forget majestic swords and tactical genius. Real history is packed with absolute madmen swinging weaponized beehives, floppy metal whips, and giant iron claws meant for pure chaos. These are 44 of the most ridiculous, bizarre, and downright stupid historical weapons that actually existed, and somehow they actually worked. 1. The lantern shield is the ultimate proof that Renaissance inventors simply did not know when to stop adding features. Originating in 16th century Italy, this was a heavy round shield that tried to be a sword, a gauntlet, a defensive wall, and a flashlight all at the same time. The sheer ambition is hilarious because it featured a lantern hanging inside the shield behind a little door, which you were supposed to open to dazzle your enemy during a night fight. In practice, you were walking into battle with a heavy metal plate, a fragile oil lamp, and 5 different spikes strapped to your arm. It was a walking fire hazard that was more likely to burn the user than confuse the opponent, turning a stealth mission into a clumsy light show. 2. Siege warfare in the Middle Ages forced castle defenders to get incredibly creative, which led to the terrifying tactic of weaponized beehives. When an army ran out of large stones or boiling oil, someone had the brilliant idea to load active, buzzing hives into a catapult and launch them over the walls. Upon hitting the ground, the woven baskets would shatter, releasing thousands of furious insects right into the tightly packed ranks of the attacking army. Armor could not protect a knight from angry bees crawling through the tiny breathing holes of an iron helmet. It instantly turned a disciplined military formation into a frantic crowd of armored men wildly slapping at their own faces in total panic. 3. Judicial duels were already a bizarre way to settle legal disputes, but the dueling shields of Hans Talhofer took the absurdity to a completely new level. These were not normal defensive tools, but massive, man-sized wooden structures covered in aggressive hooks and bizarre, protruding shapes. They were designed specifically for trial by combat, allowing disputing parties to hook each other's limbs in the strangest ways possible. The illustrations of these fights look less like a noble duel and more like 2 highly aggressive neighbors trying to wrestle to the death while wearing large wooden doors. 4. Medieval warfare was often less about eliminating the enemy and more about aggressive financial planning, which led to the invention of the mancatcher. This polearm looks exactly like a giant 2-pronged salad tong designed to snap violently around a human neck. Since a wealthy knight was worth a fortune in ransom, you used this tool to safely snag him and drag him off his horse like a misbehaving toddler in a grocery store. It turned the intense chaos of the battlefield into a bizarre, high-stakes game of capture the flag, where the flag was a very angry rich man screaming at you to let him go. 5. The nest of bees sounds like a relaxing nature documentary, but it was actually a chaotic rocket launcher from the Ming Dynasty in China. It was a hexagonal wooden bucket filled with up to 32 arrows, each strapped to a primitive gunpowder rocket. When the fuse was lit, the arrows would launch in a swarm, flying erratically in every direction with loud whistling trails of fire and smoke. It was less about hitting a specific target and more about convincing the enemy that the sky was falling, creating a terrifying visual spectacle that sent horses and soldiers running in opposite directions. 6. There is a medieval weapon from Flanders with a name that translates to Good Day, which is arguably the most sarcastic name for a murder weapon in history. Despite the polite title, the Gooden Dag was a simple, thick wooden club topped with a sharp iron spike. It became legendary when dirt-poor Flemish militias used it to completely destroy arrogant French knights. The strategy was brutally simple. You use the spike to stop the charging horse, and then use the heavy club end to wish the fallen knight a very permanent good night. It proves that you do not need expensive engineering to defeat an elite army. Just a heavy piece of wood and a lot of anger. 7. The joie is pure historical nightmare fuel that looks like it belongs to a movie villain. Used in medieval China, this weapon was essentially a giant iron hand with razor-sharp claws securely attached to the end of a long pole. The entire purpose of this bizarre creation was to reach out and violently rip away an enemy's wooden shield, or worse, tear directly through their armor and flesh. It was incredibly heavy and required a massive soldier to swing it. But the sheer psychological terror of seeing a giant metal claw flying at your face was usually enough to make enemies drop their weapons and run. 8. The Urumi is what happens when someone looks at a sword and decides it is just too rigid and safe for their liking. Originating from ancient and medieval India, this weapon is essentially a whip made of razor-sharp flexible steel blades that flail around wildly. It requires absolute mastery because if you stop swinging it for even a second, the momentum dies, and the blades can easily curl back and slice the user. It looks terrifyingly cool in motion, creating a protective bubble of slashing metal. But for anyone other than a grandmaster, it is basically a very complicated way to give yourself a haircut you did not ask for. 9. King Henry VIII is famous for his excesses, and that lack of restraint extended to his personal armory with the gunshield. These were massive wooden discs recovered from the Mary Rose that featured a primitive matchlock pistol sticking straight out of the center. The king apparently thought that holding a heavy shield while trying to aim a firearm through a tiny peephole was the peak of tactical brilliance. However, the shields were incredibly heavy to lift with one arm, and the primitive gun mechanism was just as likely to fizzle out as it was to fire. It was a clumsy attempt to combine defense and offense that mostly resulted in a very tired arm and a lot of missed shots. 10. When boiling oil was too expensive for castle defense, medieval defenders turned to the sadistic simplicity of heated sand. They would fill massive cauldrons with sand, heat it over a massive fire until it was scorching hot, and dump it on the knights attacking the walls. Unlike water or oil which runs off, the hot sand would get inside the joints of the armor and stick to the sweaty skin underneath, acting like a terrible dry sauna inside the metal suit. It was a weapon that did not require advanced technology, just dirt and fire. Yet it was incredibly effective at making heavily armored soldiers immediately regret their career choices. 11. The spring-loaded triple dagger might be the most deceptive weapon of the Renaissance, designed solely to shock the person you were fencing with. At first glance, it looked like a standard dagger, but with the press of a hidden button, the main blade would instantly split into 3 parts. 2 side blades would spring out to form a trident shape, catching the opponent's sword and leaving them completely confused. It was less of a military weapon and more of a mechanical prank played during a duel. The sheer complexity of putting springs inside a dagger handle just to startle an opponent shows how much effort went into style over substance during this era. 12. The Hussite war wagon was basically a medieval tank made out of farm equipment and pure stubbornness. These were reinforced wooden carts chained together to form mobile fortresses, complete with firing slits for crossbows and early hand cannons. When the enemy cavalry charged, they would just bounce off the wooden walls while the defenders inside fired safely from their portable castle. It completely disrupted traditional warfare because knights had no idea how to fight a circle of angry wagons that refused to move, turning open fields into impossible obstacle courses. 13. Artillery in the Middle Ages was notoriously slow, so commanders created the ribaldichin or the organ gun as a chaotic solution for maximum immediate damage. Imagine a wooden cart with 10, 20, or sometimes even more small gun barrels strapped together in a row, looking exactly like a church musical instrument. The wild idea was to fire every single barrel simultaneously to create a deafening wall of lead that no charging army could withstand. However, after that one glorious second of noise and smoke, the poor crew had to spend the next hour frantically trying to clean and reload every single tube, making it entirely useless for the rest of the battle. 14. The Flamberg sword looks like a giant bread knife designed by a madman, and that wavy blade was not just a ridiculous fashion statement. These massive two-handed swords were wielded by absolute units of mercenaries who wanted to aggressively break through enemy lines. The weird, oscillating shape of the blade caused incredibly uncomfortable vibrations when it clashed with an opponent's weapon. While it looks like a wobbly prop from a fantasy cartoon, the physics behind the wiggle were surprisingly effective at making opposing soldiers drop their own swords in sheer annoyance and vibrating confusion. 15. European peasants often had to fight with whatever was lying around the barn, which explains the rise of the billhook. Originally designed for pruning trees and snagging high branches, This tool was terrifyingly effective when the target changed from oak trees to knights on horseback. The hooked blade could grab a rider's armor or reins and yank them straight down to the mud, while the curved edge could strike through gaps in plating. It is the ultimate example of medieval recycling, proving that a tool for gardening can become a tool for winning wars if you are creative enough. 16. The Chirosophon sounds complicated, but it was essentially a handheld flamethrower used by the Byzantine Empire to ruin everyone's day. A soldier would carry a siphon tube and a pump, spraying the legendary Greek fire at enemies during sieges or naval battles. The substance was sticky and nearly impossible to extinguish, clinging to wood and sails instantly. The only downside was that the soldier was walking around a battlefield with a tank of highly volatile liquid fuel strapped to him, which meant he was arguably the bravest or most foolish person in the entire army. 17. The Capinga is what happens when an ancient African blacksmith looks at a normal throwing knife and decides it needs to be dangerously sharp in at least 3 different directions. Used by the highly aggressive Zande warriors, this was a multi-bladed throwing weapon that looked like a terrifying airborne metal puzzle. It had a main blade and several odd branches sticking out at wild angles, meaning that no matter how it hit you, a razor-sharp edge was doing the damage. Throwing it effectively without slicing off your own ear required incredible skill, turning warfare into a deadly game of extremely sharp frisbee. 18. The Swordbreaker. Dagger looks less like a weapon and more like a very aggressive hair comb for a giant. This parrying dagger had deep, jagged teeth cut into one side of the blade, designed specifically to catch an opponent's rapier. Once you trapped their thin blade in one of the grooves, a quick twist of your wrist would literally snap their sword in half or wrench it out of their hand. It was the ultimate surprise move in a duel, leaving your enemy staring at a broken handle while you stood there with a smug grin and a dagger that looked like a jagged key. 19. Caltrops are basically the medieval version of stepping on a child's toy block in the dark, but infinitely worse because they were made of sharp iron. These were small, 4-pronged spikes designed so that no matter how they landed, one spike always pointed straight up. Armies would scatter thousands of them on a battlefield to stop charging cavalry instantly. A horse would step on one, panic, and the entire charge would collapse into a pile of confused animals. It proves that you do not need a complex machine to win a war, just a pointy piece of metal and zero respect for the enemy's feet. 20. The Gross Messer is a hilarious example of malicious compliance with medieval law. In medieval Germany, only noblemen were legally allowed to carry swords, which annoyed the commoners, so they invented the big knife. By legally defining it as a knife because of how the wooden handle was constructed with slab grips, they could carry massive, sword-sized blades right under the noses of the authorities. It was functionally a 2-handed sword, capable of slicing through almost anything, but because it had a knife handle, the law could not touch them. It was the historical equivalent of pointing at a tank and telling the police it is just a heavy bicycle. 21. Clearing an enemy ship's deck did not always require heavy cannons when you could just use biological disgust with stink pots. These were fragile earthenware jars tightly packed with sulfur, rotting fish, quicklime, and other foul-smelling chemical nightmares. During medieval naval boarding actions, sailors would light a quick fuse and hurl these pots onto enemy ships, where they would shatter and release a thick cloud of noxious, choking gas. The smell was so profoundly unbearable that battle-hardened sailors would become violently ill and surrender just to escape the stench. It was warfare reduced to its most disgusting form, proving that a terrible odor can win a fight. 22. The Meteor Hammer was less a hammer and more a test of coordination under pressure. Originating in China, it consisted of a heavy metal weight attached to a long rope or chain. The wielder would keep the weight in constant circular motion, building speed before launching it toward an opponent. Its true strength was unpredictability. It could strike from unusual angles, wrap around limbs, or knock weapons from hands. Rather than brute force, it relied on rhythm and flow, making it a weapon that blurred the line between martial discipline and controlled chaos. 23. The zhugnu, or Chinese repeating crossbow, dramatically increased firing speed compared to traditional crossbows. With a top-mounted magazine and a simple lever mechanism, a soldier could release multiple bolts in rapid succession. The individual bolts were lighter and less powerful than those from larger crossbows, which meant the weapon favored volume over penetration. Some historical sources suggest that poison was occasionally applied to bolts to compensate for this limitation, though practices likely varied. Its true strength was psychological and tactical saturation rather than precision sniping. 24. The Aztec Macuahuitl was a wooden club embedded with sharp obsidian blades along its edges. Obsidian can be incredibly sharp when freshly fractured, capable of producing extremely fine cutting edges. However, it is also brittle and prone to chipping. Spanish accounts describe its devastating cutting power, particularly against unarmored targets and even horses. Yet, after several heavy strikes, the obsidian inserts could break or loosen. It was a weapon optimized for terrifying impact rather than long-term durability, combining lethal sharpness with inherent fragility. 25. The pata from India is what happens when a warrior decides they never want to use their wrist ever again. This was a gauntlet sword where the blade was integrated directly into a full metal arm guard that covered the forearm up to the elbow. Unlike a normal sword, you could not swing it with your wrist. You had to punch and slash using your entire body weight, essentially turning your arm into a rigid, robotic striking limb. It was devastating for slashing through defenses from horseback, but if you needed to do anything remotely delicate, like scratch your nose or open a door, you were completely out of luck. 26. The Allspe is a medieval polearm that looks exactly like the skeleton of a broken umbrella. While most spears had simple, leaf-shaped points, this bizarre weapon featured a long, thin, square spike that was almost 3 feet long, with a massive metal disc placed right at the base of the blade. The disc was not just for decoration. It was designed to stop the spike from going too far into an enemy, ensuring the weapon would not get stuck in a shield or armor. It essentially looked like you were carrying a giant, highly aggressive fencing foil on a stick, designed purely to poke holes in heavy cavalry without losing your grip. 27. The fire lance is the great-grandfather of the gun, but it looked more like a firework strapped to a spear by a madman. Originating in 10th century China, it was a bamboo tube filled with gunpowder and rough sand attached to the end of a spear. When you lit the fuse, it did not shoot a bullet. It spewed a short-range blast of fire and grit right into the enemy's face. It was a chaotic, one-shot weapon that was heavily prone to exploding in your own hands and mostly useful for scaring horses. Yet, this chaotic tube of bamboo on a stick is the very reason modern firearms exist today. 28. The Shotel is a sword from ancient and medieval Ethiopia that looks like it was designed by someone who absolutely hates shields. Unlike a European straight sword, the Shotel has a massive, wicked curve that looks almost like a sickle or a giant hook. The design intent was pure genius. When an enemy raised their shield to block, the curve allowed the blade to reach right around the shield and hook the defender behind the neck or back. It was a weapon that completely ignored the rules of defense, forcing opponents to fight awkwardly because their main piece of protection was suddenly useless against a sword that could bend around corners. 29. The Bog Knock, which literally translates to tiger's claw, is possibly the most deceitful weapon ever created, designed for people who wanted a peaceful hug to turn into a sudden assassination. Originating from medieval India, this weapon consisted of 4 curved metal claws attached to a bar that fit perfectly concealed inside the palm of the hand. It was entirely invisible to the naked eye until the very last second. The most famous historical use was when a military leader pretended to embrace an opposing general during a peace treaty meeting, only to instantly gut him with the hidden claws. It proves that the deadliest weapon is often the one you cannot see. 30. The Miseracord has a name that literally translates to mercy from French, which is a deeply ironic title for a tool designed specifically for the absolute end of a fight. This was a medieval dagger with a blade so incredibly narrow and thick that it did not even have a cutting edge. You could not slice an apple with it. Its only purpose was to be shoved through the tiny gaps in a fallen knight's plate armor, like the eye slits or armpits, to deliver a final thrust. Using it meant the battle was already over, and you were just doing the grim administrative work of clearing the battlefield. 31. The bec de Corbin translates from French to crow's beak, and it was basically a medieval can opener designed for heavy armor. As knights began wearing full steel plate armor, swords became almost completely useless, so weapons had to get creatively destructive. This polearm featured a heavy hammerhead on one side and a thick curved spike on the other. Instead of trying to cut through steel, soldiers would swing the spike with all their might to punch a jagged hole straight through the armor, hooking the knight and dragging him down. It was essentially turning warfare into aggressive demolition work, where the goal was to shatter the heavy packaging. 32. If a crossbow and a mousetrap had a terrifying medieval baby, it would be the Springald. Unlike standard catapults that lobbed rocks over walls in a high arc, the Springald was an indoor siege engine designed to shoot massive wooden bolts perfectly straight. It used tension from twisted animal sinew to snap two wooden arms forward, launching projectiles the size of fence posts with massive force. It was almost always mounted inside castle towers to shoot down long hallways or narrow bridges. It was incredibly accurate, assuming your weapon weighed 1,000 pounds and required a team of carpenters just to pull the string back. 33. The military flail is perhaps the most high-risk weapon ever invented, mostly because it was just as likely to send the user to the hospital as the enemy. It consisted of a heavy, spiked iron ball attached to a wooden handle by a short chain, designed to swing wildly around an opponent's shield. The fatal flaw was that the chain made the weapon incredibly unpredictable. If you swung it with maximum anger and missed your target, the momentum would easily bring the heavy iron ball swinging right back into your own face. It took a special kind of bravery to use a weapon that required a physics degree just to avoid knocking yourself totally unconscious. 34. There is a weapon with the absolutely ridiculous name of the Bohemian earspoon, and despite sounding like a hygiene tool for giants, it was actually a terrifying polearm. Used primarily in Central Europe, it was a spear with two wide, outward-flaring lugs at the base of the blade that stopped the weapon from penetrating too deep into a charging horse. The name comes from its vague resemblance to the tiny spoons people used to clean their ears back then, but in reality, it was used by peasant armies to forcefully stop armored cavalry in their tracks. It remains the only weapon in history that sounds like a bathroom accessory. 35. The shillelagh proves that medieval Irish farmers could turn literally anything into a devastating weapon, including a simple walking stick. They would take a piece of blackthorn wood, which is incredibly dense, but the preparation was what made it absurd. They would smear the stick in butter and place it up the chimney to cure in the smoke for months until it was as hard as iron. Often, the root ball was left on the end to act as a heavy club head. It was technically just a walking cane, but functionally, it was a smoke-cured, butter-basted impact tool disguised as an innocent mobility aid. 36. The Katar is an Indian punch dagger that completely changes the mechanics of traditional fighting. Instead of holding a handle like a normal knife, you gripped a horizontal bar so the blade sat directly over your knuckles, effectively turning your fist into a spear tip. This design allowed warriors to put their entire body weight behind a punch, striking through heavy defenses with incredible force. It was often called the tongue of death, and was sometimes made with a mechanical spring that split the blade open. It is the ultimate weapon for someone who thinks boxing would be much better if everyone had steel spikes attached to their hands. 37. The glaive guisarme is a medieval polearm that looks less like a planned design and more like a blacksmith accidentally dropped all his spare parts into the forge. As infantry tried to figure out how to stop heavily armored cavalry, they just kept adding features to their spears. This weapon had a long slashing blade, a thrusting point, a large hook to pull riders off horses, and usually another spike pointing backward just in case. It is hilariously overcomplicated, looking like a massive metal puzzle glued to the end of a 6-foot pole, perfectly reflecting how panicked foot soldiers were about charging horses. 38. The kusarigama is what happens when medieval Japanese warriors decide that carrying a normal sword is just too predictable, and they want to deeply confuse everyone on the battlefield. This bizarre weapon consisted of a sharp iron sickle attached to a heavy metal weight by a long chain. The fighting style was completely erratic. The user would swing the heavy weight in massive circles to smash enemy armor, and then pull them close to finish the job with the sickle. It took years of intense training to avoid knocking out your own teeth with the spinning weight, making it a terrifying whirlwind of unpredictable metal. 39. Hunting wild boars in the Middle Ages was exceptionally dangerous, which led to the invention of the highly specific boar sword. This was a long blade that featured a literal iron crossbar jutting out horizontally a few inches behind the tip. The practical idea was to stab the charging beast, and the crossbar would stop the furious animal from simply sliding down the sharp steel and reaching the hunter. However, when soldiers started taking these into actual human battles, the design looked utterly ridiculous. Wielding a massive sword with a random metal bar poking out near the top made it incredibly easy to get tangled in enemy shields. 40. The chakram is a weapon from India that looks incredibly simple but requires absolute mastery to throw without hurting yourself. It is a perfectly circular flat metal ring that is razor sharp on the entire outer edge. Warriors would spin it around their index finger and throw it with tremendous force. The aerodynamics of a metal circle meant it could fly incredibly far and with terrifying accuracy. The most visually absurd part of this weapon is how the warriors carried their ammunition. They would stack these sharp metal halos on top of their tall turbans, wearing their entire arsenal right on their heads like a very dangerous metallic tower. 41. The fustabalis, or the staff sling, proves that sometimes the most effective weapons are just basic farm tools attached to a stick. Roman and medieval armies realized that a normal leather sling was good, but tying that sling to the end of a long wooden pole was somehow a tactical masterpiece. It looks like a tool a peasant would use to knock fruit out of a tall tree, but the extra leverage allowed a single soldier to launch a heavy stone with crushing force from a massive distance. It is hilariously simple, consisting of just a piece of wood and some string, yet it could cave in an iron helmet easily. 42. The Zweihander was the signature weapon of the German mercenary forces, and its absurdity is based entirely on its completely unmanageable size. These two-handed swords were often over 6 feet long and weighed so much that they could not be drawn from a standard scabbard. Instead, the warriors had to march into battle carrying these massive blades over their shoulders like a carpenter carrying a heavy wooden beam. The soldiers who wielded them received double pay precisely because their job was to run to the very front lines and wildly swing this giant piece of steel to knock aside the wooden pikes of the opposing army. 43. The sword staff is what happens when Scandinavian soldiers get completely indecisive about whether they want to use a sword or a spear. Instead of inventing something entirely new, they literally just took a standard two-edged sword blade and bolted it tightly onto the end of a very long wooden pole. It gave you the reach of a spear, but allowed you to slice and chop like a swordsman, completely confusing enemies who expected a simple poking weapon. It is beautifully lazy engineering, taking two things that already work perfectly fine on their own and securely attaching them together to create a surprisingly effective long-distance chopping machine. 44. The plumbata proves that the mighty Roman and Byzantine empires were not above using aggressively lethal lawn darts to win a war. These were essentially heavy lead-weighted darts with iron spikes that soldiers carried strapped to the inside of their shields. Instead of just throwing them like a normal spear, soldiers would lob them high into the air so they rained down vertically on the enemy. A sudden shower of heavy armor-piercing darts dropping straight from the sky was absolutely terrifying, perfectly demonstrating that the most advanced military in the world still loved a good, deadly throwing game. So, which of these absurd weapons proves our ancestors were completely out of their minds? More importantly, history is full of tactical disasters. So what unbelievably stupid weapon did we completely forget to mention? Drop your wildest historical picks in the comments so we can argue about it, and hit that like and subscribe button before you step on a medieval caltrop.